got their space here in the conference. So, without further ado, we hand over now to our next speaker, Daniel Marin.
Estableciendo conexión con Montevideo, Uruguay.
Establishing connection with Montevideo, Uruguay, a city known for Art Deco, colonial homes, and the symbols like the Palacio Salco and the neoclassical style.
Desde esta ciudad nos acompaña
From this city, joining us is Daniel Marin, senior developer and from Angular Montevideo. Let's see what makes a form be accessible and how they can create forms that we can all face. Now we have Daniel. We solved our technical issues and we are introducing Daniel Marin. He's Venezuelan and he's located in the city of Montevideo, Uruguay. So Daniel, how are you? Well, everything's great. You know, there's always some technical issue going on, even if we tested and everything before, but something always happens. So thank you all for the organization and very happy and very excited to be on now. Yes, so you're very happy. Are you nervous? Everything good? Everything cool? Of course, yes, everything was great. Everything under control. I saw there's a lot of people connected, so it's a higher number than normal. I can't deny that, you know, I'm a bit nervous, but hopefully everything will be under control. Yes, of course. So I leave you now and shake off those nerves and let's hear your presentation. Thank you, Adri. So the forms are a key part of web development. Angular is not the exception. The main goal of a form is to allow the users to interact with us. As developers, we spend hours working with applications. We've designed a lot of forms. We've used even more forms. We think that using a form is very simple and that everyone sees it the way we do, but the truth be told, for many users, to use a form can be a headache. For us, as developers, many times we think it's not. But for people with lesser contact with technology or who suffer from some sort of disability, forms could represent an obstacle that don't allow them to meet their goals, which is basically using your app. So today, I'm going to talk to you about forms one can use in forms everyone can use the name in English. So I'm not going to give you the silver bullet solution for everything, but what I'm going to teach you today are some things that maybe some of you already know and that can help many of your users in case that they are not doing it yet. My name is Daniel Marin. I'm a software engineer, Vsoft Labs, and I am the coordinator for Angular Montevideo. So we're going to talk about this topic now. First, the language. This chat is in Spanish, but the title is in English. So first of all, that's why I had to give the translation of the name. We have to find or seek for our application to do the same thing. So lucky for us as programmers, HTML does it for us. HTML allows us to specify the language of our document. So all we have to do is worry about specifying a language, not that we have to define everything or change the structure we have. So this is especially important for users with screen reader. So to make sure I convince them, because maybe you haven't used a screen reader before, I'm going to show you a tongue twister in Spanish that goes as follows. While he's saying this in Spanish, this is a tongue twister with R's. Now, I'm going to show you how this looks with the screen reader if you don't set up the language correctly. Well, what do you think? It doesn't make sense, right? Because the intonation, modulation, the accent, when you speak in English. So I imagine your face is saying, what? Because the truth is, yes. So this was happening, and I doubted everything that was going on. So this was more about accessibility. So this is very simple to solve. Like I said, this is a solution that's integrated in HTML. We don't have to do anything additional. What we have to do now is to define the language, the general language of the application. For in general terms, it's a single language. But let's assume that there's an application in several languages, but at a certain time, it only has one language on. So if you have a blog with different languages, perhaps you need to have the ability to specify the language in a code segment or HTML. So here we see in the left example, this is the link that Angular creates, and then you have the len attribute, but you place it with the n value. So as you can see here, I wrote S for Spanish to say this document is in Spanish. So most commonly, every application has a language. So even if it works in different languages, at a given time, it'll be at one language. So if you have everything in English, you have a paragraph that comes in Spanish, then you can do what I'm doing here to the right and specify the language to a specific element in your language. Don't forget to label your fields. A label is the name that we give a field for the users to identify. Generally speaking, we try to use descriptive names that indicate the purpose of the field. Without labels, the users would have a hard time to find a form, what makes users unhappy. We're not looking for that, of course. We want our users not to complain. We want them to be happy. So the most common topic and the fact that a field has a text doesn't mean that it has a title or a label. So he's going to correct himself. Labels have to be configured in a specific way and following a procedure which is already being defined. The fact that we have a text on top, below, to the side of an input doesn't mean that it's the label. It means just that you have a text close by. So to be able to illustrate what I'm saying, look at the two inputs. They look identical in everything. But although they look the same, I'm going to ask you, can you hear them the same way? Okay, let's see. We're going to test the one on the left first. I did this using MBDA, which is a screen reading software. Let's see how you can hear it. Blank edition, it doesn't say anything else. So if our fields are like this, they look great, but we don't have a well-defined label. So all the fields we have in our application are going to say edition in blank or blank edition. But if we define a label correctly or properly following the steps, name star blank edition. So that's the difference between a label and a name. So if we have that text, we're connecting semantically with the label and the input. So that's what makes it really be a label. So let's learn how to configure labels. There are several ways. So I want to show each one and explain that each one of these are, well, they don't look the same, but they can be heard the same. These three options can be done, and you can hear them exactly in the same way. But I want to clarify that, what we're going to use each one of them for. Option one, well, the only problem with this method is that we need to create a single ID for each input. In the case of Angular, it's common for it to have reusable components. So you need to be careful because it's easy that if you create an input and then you reuse it in the same page, the problem is that you're going to have a duplicate. So this is something that we need to avoid in order to have a more proper, correct structure in our code. Plus, of course, we're talking about accessibility. Option two practically is the same thing, but it's the other way around. So the identifier is given on the label and the input has the label. So it's the same issue in ID, a single ID. So if you ask yourselves, how could we not have the single ID, a solution is to use option 3. So with option 3, there's no need to do an ID and a reference because automatically you're going to write that directly into the input. So the problem with this is that although it looks the same and it is heard the same, it does not, you can't see it the same way. Let me explain myself. So we're leaving our users aside that don't use the real, and you can't do this either. When you're looking for accessibility, you can't sacrifice the users that don't use the reader. So if you ask me, look, Daniel, what is the option you recommend? Well, I'd say the best option is this one. This is the best option because in this case, when I add the input, HTML automatically connects it. So otherwise, I don't have an ID. So you need use this method to create these appropriate labels and having the guarantee not to have a repeated ID, which is great. And in addition, it looks and is heard. The example with the sounds, this is the one on the right. You can see and you can hear it properly. The next step to take into account is that in case of a mistake, we need to know what happened. So it's common for a form to have many restrictions, and in a way, it's possible to guarantee that there's a certain level of consistency every time the form is sent by different users. And if there's an error, we say that the form is invalid, and at least one of those fields has a validation mistake. So those errors can be shown right under the field, and the detail here is that with the labels, it doesn't matter if you show them on top or on the bottom. The important thing is the fact that that there is a connection between the input and the error. So let's see how we can connect that. Briefly, I'm going to show you how to use this. I'm not going to go into details here. This is not the topic of the chat, but we create a form. We have two fields, name, last name. Using Angular's validators, we can add several fields whenever we configure our form. And in this case, I only added the validation required. So I just wanted to test or make sure that both the name and the last name are always supplied. So the user always gives us that information. That's all this does. Next thing we have to do is that we have the errors in our forms in Angular and code, and we have the knowledge of the form and the structure, if there's an error or not. We could do things that are acting in consequence. So our HTML doesn't have the errors. It doesn't display them, so we're going to display those here. How do we show those? Well, I recommend that you create a diff like this one, where you group all the validation errors from certain fields, and then each one of the errors, you make sure you have a single ID. And careful, we have the problem again that they have to be a single ID, and they have to be careful how to use that. And personally speaking, what I do is I create a component, an input, where I encapsulate all this and make sure that I just use single IDs. Maybe it's not the best strategy in a certain case, but it depends on the application. But just so you understand, this is a topic that you can do, and you're always going to have this in accessibility. It's something very common. So in consequence, we have all the errors, and we're going to have this ID. And what we do is we can add the input using this reference here. As you can see to the right, you have the ID name required, and you add it to this in the input. So this is an important detail. An area described by could receive several references, several texts. So we could have 10 errors and then separate each one of the items in space, and then you concatenate them. Also, I recommend that you have a single error because of the accessibility and ensuring that there's a single error at a time. And another detail is the area invalid. Look, if you can see, you can have an area invalid here on the input, and that means that although the truth is that the forms in Angular are very complete and you use them quite a bit, this is a detail that I found, and the invalid area is not automatically configured. So manually, you have to configure the input to update the value area invalid so that with the screen readers, the users can understand that that attribute has a problem. So here is the same example. We have two things. They look the same. We have two inputs. They have a different text. It would appear that they have validation, but the difference is that one of them is okay and one is not. Let's hear the first one without anything. It just text, name, star, invalid entry. It didn't say anything about the error. So imagine the experience of someone reading this or listening to this reader, and it doesn't even know what the errors are. So if we do all the configuration, look what happens. Please introduce your name, blank. See? So with those additions, we're not talking about just extra code or modification of a structure or anything like that. But with a couple of changes, we were able to help the user to know what is the error. So another important detail I want to mention is when grouping the actions in important forms, the forms by definition have a certain function, and that is submit, reset. Every form has that or should have that. So we're tempted to uploading the forms with a click or with a click event. We're creating a button, clicking on it, and that would submit. Now, that's not completely correct because we're not using the native function of the form to do that. Now, for that purpose, we have to group the actions on that form and use ng-submit and reset to appropriately make use semantically correct. And apart from that, it's important to know that you can allow the user to enter in the form once it's sent. So what I want to say basically is that it's something like what I'm showing you here. Try to avoid having the actions for submit in the forms outside the form. And if you're inside, make sure you use ng-submit and the right methods. It's worth mentioning that if you do it this way, the user can enter and nothing's going to happen because enter is connected to the submit in the form, not with the event on the outside. So we wouldn't be doing anything. So here's what I'm saying you should try to do. Like I'm using ng-submit here to connect with submit and reset to connect with reset. And here we have the native functionality that HTML provides us with. So it's interesting here, and why I wanted to add it is because this does not just benefit the users with screen reader, but also all the users. So I'm sure we're all used to writing and entering in the same form. So if we don't do this, then this functionality will be lost, and we have to do it by hand. So I don't recommend that. This is something we should try to avoid. And interesting to see the relationship that exists between accessibility and usability. And why should we leave accessibility for the end? Because this could imply a change in structure. Let's assume that we have the actions outside the form because of our design. Well, if we had detected that at the time of the design, we would have made a decision about it. So that's why it's interesting to see how accessible it is, and it's part of every day, and where we don't have, we're not familiar with the tools that we have in our hands. Self-completion is your friend. So browsers have the ability to say writing and then self-complete inputs. This is not just self-completing an input, but also give an additional purpose to the fields. So if we have self-completion, then automatically the browser, depending on what it has, it could be something like Chrome, it's going to help you and indicate what field it is and what additional information you have. Personally speaking, I hate forms. I hate filling forms by hand on the computer. I hate it. Once I broke my left hand, I'm a lefty, and I hated with all my heart all these forms because self-completion was very good. In Chrome, you could configure all your information. So once you had all the information, you just completed it, and when you understood how it works, then I'm like, okay, now I can use it a lot. So here's some options. I'm not going to go into detail because you're going to fall asleep if I tell you every option. There's a lot of options in self-completion. Among them, we have name, full name, uh, honorific prefix, Mr., Mrs., Doctor, engineer, and the given name, which is your first name. So that's the example. The name is an input. Nombre is where you ask the name of the person, and you write given name. That means the person's first name. Family name in this case is if I had last name instead of name or given name, you have family name, which is your last name. And then that gives you context. And so touching the topic of accessibility, but it's with benefits. The whole description of the self-completion process is written down in the documentation WVCGA version 2.1. Input purposes, and if you're interested, you can follow me and you can contact me on Twitter, and I will send you a link. I'm going to post it on my networks, and then I'll post it on the chat here as well. So this is the cherry on top. So I want to teach you how you can help your users at the programming level do things to help. You've noticed probably that nothing more than configuring on HTML. So apart from reactive forms, everything I've explained works in HTML, JavaScript, and there's no need for Angular. So there's no need or direct need. So I wanted to introduce this part to see what you can do as programmers to go to the next level in the experience of your users. And I want to you to think about validation and errors. Imagine a form. If you what happens, the ability to perform, have to read it for you. Imagine. Imagine you have a mistake or an error and you don't know what it is. So imagine you have a pull request, and if you're the person who's writing the code says, look, the change is not approved because there's an error. Imagine that. So imagine that, what can you do with that? Okay, well, for that reason, the users and the bad time someone could have with a screen reader, if we don't give them the right tools, or if we give an error or it's complicated, then imagine we don't tell them that there's an error or we don't help them. So we can show you how we could do something extra, including code, to improve the experience of your users. First thing we have to do is go to the component. In this case, I have my friendly component where I created, first thing I want you to see is I created a failed field line property called template, error template, using the decorator blue child because I want to have that reference in HTML. And then here in the submit, what I have is if it's an invalid form, I want you to go through all of the controls and all the fields. And for every field that's invalid, I want you to add a new entry in this failed field. In the failed field, you're going to have the title, which is the name of the field, and an ID, which will be the URL. And then I'm going to teach you what that is. And finally, we have errors.native element that allow us to focus the user towards the error. The next step is to configure HTML and the section that this whole field is going to contain. So as you can see, we have # template so that our view child knows what we want to do. Tab index -1. Tab index is an attribute that has the element of HTML and to give the ability to receive focus. So if you realize, if you go tab when you're browsing, you could jump between inputs and tab index or something. That something is a, so you can have focus. So that is -1 here because with tab I can get to the element, but programmatically speaking from Angular or JavaScript, I do have that capability. And then finally, we go through each one of the failed fields and we show a message, error found in the name of the field, and we use that ID as href. This is the trick for you to be able to see the error in the failed field as a link, and when you interact with it, you're sent directly to the corresponding field. Now, something else very interesting, because this text where it is, when we send the focus to the user in this error template, the first thing that they read is, or we tell the user is automatically when there's an error, there was an error, and tell them what the errors were. So imagine how we improve that experience for the people who don't exactly see what they're doing. So here's the end result. Fields with asterisk validation errors were found in sending the file. The errors list could be found below. Error found in name. Link visited, error found in last name. Error found in name. Error found in last name. Last name, star, addition, invalid entry is self-completed. Please introduce your last name. So as you can see, this was something that we integrated in a solution that gives a much easier experience. With these instructions, the users have a way to navigate. So I have 20 seconds left, so I'm going to tell you very quickly. I hope it's clear for you that not all the users are the same, and that we have to be concerned about giving everyone the best possible experience. And or that it looks good doesn't mean that it could be heard well. So we need to consider this. And we have to think about accessibility during design to save some headaches, and that with some small attributes or adjustments, you could drastically improve the experience of our users. Thank you very much, everyone, for having listened. Thank you to the organization team, Adriana, and I'll leave you my social networks here. If you have a question or, well, look at the other talks. I talk about this a lot because I'm very motivated about it. So thank you all. She is muted right now. She is muted right now. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Daniel, for this excellent talk. And I don't know if you heard this chat, but everyone went crazy. They loved your information and very useful information. Excellent talk. So congratulations for this, Daniel.
Thank you all. Please